At the next meeting of the Board of Trustees, Hardin sat at the foot of the table, speculating idly as to just what it was that made physical scientists such poor administrators. It might be merely that they were too used to malleable fact, and far too unused to pliable people. In any case, there they were, Thomas Sutt, George Farrar on his left, London Crast and Yate Fulham on his right, with Pirenne presiding. Hardin had dozed through the initial formalities. He perked up when Pirenne sipped at the glass of water before him by way of preparation, and announced to the board that he had received word that Lord Dorwin, Chancellor of the Empire, would arrive in Terminus within 2 weeks, a visit that was certain to result in satisfactory relations with Anacreon. Hardin snickered below his breath. Then he asked Pirenne, just what do you expect that Dorwin can accomplish? And aside from this stroke of diplomacy, has anything meaningful been done to meet the Anacreonic menace? Yate Fulham, drawing one hand along his ferocious red mustache, asked Hardin if he really did see a menace. Listen, said Hardin. What there was of the Imperial Navy in these regions is in the hands of the 4 kingdoms now, and Anacreon has its share. He tried to make them face facts. They'd had 2 months' grace so far because they'd given Anacreon the idea that they had nuclear weapons, which, as they all knew, was a little white lie. The Anacreonians were going to find that out soon, and they weren't going to enjoy having been jollied along. The board began to protest, but Hardin was just warming up. It's all very well to drag chancellors into this, he said, but it would be much nicer to great big siege guns fitted for beautiful nuclear bombs into it. We've had 2 months, gentlemen, and we may not have another 2 months to lose. What do you propose to do? The members of the board sputtered about Terminus being a scientific foundation, nothing else. No other priority mattered but the encyclopedia, come what may. Hardin groaned in spirit. The board seemed to suffer violently from encyclopedia on the brain. Hardin told them that this was a new generation. Of the 1,000,000 people on Terminus, only 150,000 worked directly on the encyclopedia. The rest wanted protection for their homes, their farms, their factories. He was shouted down with cries of, "We are scientists!" Hardin leaped through the opening. What kind of science was it that classified the knowledge of the past with no thought of working onward, extending that knowledge, or improving upon it? He called it stagnation. That's why the periphery is revolting. That's why petty wars are becoming eternal. And that's why whole systems are losing nuclear power and going back to barbarous techniques of chemical power. If you ask me, said Hardin, the Galactic Empire is dying. 2 or 3 people attempted to answer him simultaneously. George Farrar got the floor. His ponderous voice, every bit as ponderous as his 300-pound body, burst its way out to remind everyone that in a month they would be celebrating the Foundation's 50th anniversary. Hari Seldon's vault would be opened at that time. Had they considered what might be in it? Doesn't it occur to you, asked Farrar, that the vault is opening at a very convenient time? Hardin eyed him thoughtfully. What was he getting at? Farrar's theory was that Seldon, as the greatest psychohistorian of his time and founder of the Foundation, might well have used his science to determine the probable course of history. Most likely he would have found a way to warn Terminus of danger and perhaps point out a solution. The remainder of the meeting was devoted to the visit of Lord Dorwin, the Chancellor of the Empire. But Hardin kept thinking of the vault. Things were falling into place, just a little. Little angles were fitting together, 1 or 2. And psychohistory was the key, he was sure of that. A great psychohistorian such as Seldon could unravel human emotions and reactions sufficiently to be able to predict broadly the historical sweep of the future. And what would that mean? Lord Dorwin took snuff. He also had long hair, curled intricately and quite obviously artificially. to which were added a pair of fluffy blonde sideburns, which he fondled affectionately. Then, too, he spoke in over-precise statements. At the moment, Harden had no time to think of more reasons for the instant detestation in which he held the noble chancellor. The problem now was to locate him. He had disappeared with Pirenne a half an hour before, passed clean out of sight, blast him. But Pirenne had been seen in this wing and on this floor. It was simply a matter of trying every door. Halfway down he said, "Ah," and stepped into a darkened room. The profile of Lord Dorwin's intricate hairdo was unmistakable against the lighted screen. Lord Dorwin looked up and said, "Ah, Harden, a great achievement, this encyclopedia of yours." Harden tried to shift the conversation to the Anacreonians and their efficiency in a destructive direction. "Ah, yes, Anacreon. I have just come through there. Most barbarous planet. It is thoroughly inconceivable that human beings could live here in the periphery. The lack of the most elementary requirements of a cultivated—" Harden interrupted, dryly commenting that the Anacreonians, unfortunately, had all the elementary requirements and all the fundamental necessities for destruction. Quite, said Lord Dorwin. He seemed annoyed, perhaps at being stopped midway in his sentence. "But we aren't to discuss business now, you know. Really, I'm otherwise concerned." He turned to Pirenne. "Aren't you going to show me the second volume of the encyclopedia, Dr. Pirenne? Do, please." To Pirenne's annoyance, Harden steered the conversation back to Anacreon, and the fact that the independent kingdoms of the periphery had lost nuclear power. "I'm not at all surprised," said Lord Dorwin. "Barbarous planets. Oh, but my dear fellow, don't call them independent. They aren't, you know. The treaties we've made with them are proof positive of that. They acknowledge the sovereignty of the Emperor. They'd have to, of course, or we wouldn't treat with them." Harden pointed out that they had considerable freedom of action. "Yes, I suppose so," agreed Lord Dorwin. "Considerable. But that scarcely matters. The Empire is far better off with a periphery thrown upon its own resources, as it is, more or less. They aren't any good to us, you know. Barbarous planets, scarcely civilized." Harden reminded his lordship that they had not only been civilized in the past, but that Anacreon was once the richest of the outlying provinces. "Oh, but Harden, that was centuries ago," retorted Lord Dorwin. "Things were different in the old great days. We aren't the men we used to be, you know. But Harden, come. You are a most persistent chap. I told you I simply won't discuss business today. Leave it for next day." And that was that. This was the second meeting of the board that Harden had attended, if one were to exclude the informal talks the board members had had with the now departed Lord Dorwin. Yet the mayor had a perfectly definite idea that at least one other, and possibly two or three, had been held to which he had somehow never received an invitation. Nor, it seemed to him, would he have received notification of this one, had it not been for the ultimatum. Harden fingered it gingerly. It started off floridly with a salutation from His Puissant Majesty the King of Anacreon to his friend and brother Dr. Louis Pirenne, Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Encyclopedia Foundation No. 1. And it ended even more lavishly with a gigantic multicolored seal of the most involved symbolism. But it was an ultimatum just the same. It turned out there hadn't been much time at all, only 3 months, which the Foundation had thrown away unused. "This document," observed Harden, "gives us 1 week. What do we do now?" Pirenne insisted there must be a loophole. He could not believe matters would be pushed to this extremity in the face of Lord Dorwin's assurances regarding the attitude of the Emperor and the Empire. The corner of Harden's mouth lifted in a sour half-smile. As far as he was concerned, Lord Dorwin's contribution to the situation was the direct cause of this friendly little note. Hardin proceeded to remove a few sheets of paper from the pad under his arm and spread them out to show the scientists the meaning of the symbols which he had interpreted by the division of logic. The message boiled down easily and straightforwardly to the unqualified statement roughly translated as, "You give us what we want in a week, or we take it by force." Replacing the sheets, Hardin produced a copy of the treaty between the Empire and Anacreon, incidentally signed on the Emperor's behalf by the recently departed Lord Dorwin. Properly analyzed, 90% of the treaty was meaningless. "What we end up with," said Hardin, "can be described in the following interesting manner. Obligations of Anacreon to the Empire? None. Powers of the Empire over Anacreon? None. The treaty was nothing but a declaration of total independence on the part of Anacreon, and a recognition of that status by the Empire." "But what," interposed Thomas Sutt, "of Lord Dorwin's assurances of Empire support?" Hardin threw himself back in his chair. "You know," he said, "that is the most interesting part of this business." Whereupon he informed the board that while he had thought Lord Dorwin a most consummate donkey when they first met, he had turned out to be an accomplished diplomat and a most clever man. Hardin based his opinion on the fact that he had taken the liberty of recording all of his lordship's statements. There was a flurry, and Pirenne opened his mouth in horror. "In 5 days of discussion," said Hardin, "Lord Dorwin didn't say one damn thing, and said it so you never noticed. There are the assurances you had from your precious Empire." "So," Hardin concluded, "when you sent threats, and that's what they were, concerning Empire action to Anacreon, you merely irritated a monarch who knew better. We have 1 week left, and what do we do now?" It was generally agreed that they had no choice but to allow Anacreon to establish military bases on Terminus. "But," Hardin asked, "what do we do toward kicking them off at the first opportunity?" Yate Fulham's mustache twitched. He feared the use of violence. "Violence," came Hardin's retort, "is the last refuge of the incompetent. But I certainly don't intend to lay down the welcome mat and brush off the best furniture for their use." Pirenne began to speak of compromise. Hardin had the nightmare-like sensation of running at top speed and getting nowhere. There was no compromise. This bosh about military bases was drivel. Hort Roderick had hinted at what Anacreon was after: outright annexation and imposition of its own feudal system. "What is left of our bluff of nuclear power," he concluded, "may force them to move slowly, but they will move none the less." He had risen indignantly, and the rest rose with him, except for George Farrar. His shrewd eyes were half closed, and perspiration gleamed on the smooth expanse of his chin. "The real solution to the problem," said Farrar, "lies in what is to be revealed to us when the vault opens 6 days from now." "Is that your contribution to the matter?" said Hardin. "We are to do nothing, except to wait in quiet serenity and utter faith for the Deus Ex Machina to pop out of the vault?" Hardin disputed Farrar's theory that Seldon would have foreseen the current dilemma and established the vault as a method of showing the Foundation the way out. He felt it lacked common sense. It was well known, for instance, that Seldon had maneuvered the commissioners on Trantor into ordering the Foundation established on Terminus. Why should he have done so? Why put it out here at all if he could see in advance the break in communications, the isolation from the rest of the galaxy, the threat of neighbors, and the helplessness because of the lack of metals on Terminus? And why, if he foresaw all this, had he not warned the original settlers in advance, so that they might have had time to prepare, rather than wait, as he was doing, until 1 foot was over the cliff before doing so? "Do you deny," asked Farrar, "that Hari Seldon could easily have worked out historical trends of the future by simple psychohistorical technique?" "No, of course not," cried Hardin. "But we can't rely on him for a solution. At best he might indicate the problem, But if there is ever to be a solution, we must work it out ourselves. He can't do it for us." Fulham spoke suddenly. He wanted to know what Hardin meant by indicate the problem, as if one didn't know the problem. Hardin whirled on him. "You think Anacreon is all Hari Seldon is likely to be worried about?" he said. "I tell you, gentlemen, that none of you has the faintest conception of what is really going on." Hardin jumped up. His eyes were cold and hard. "There is something smelly about the whole situation," he said. "Something that is bigger than anything we've talked about yet." Then he posed the following question to the board. Why was it that among the original population of the Foundation, there was only one first-class psychohistorian included, and he carefully refrained from training his pupils in more than the fundamentals? A short silence fell. "Perhaps," offered Hardin, "it was because the psychohistorian might have caught on to what was going on, and too soon to suit Hari Seldon." Mayor Hardin chewed at the end of his cigar. He was with his ally, Johann Lee. What they were about to do had to be done with impudence. There was to be no hesitation, no time to allow the board to grasp the situation. "Once we are in a position to give orders," said Hardin, "why give them as though you were born to do so, and they'll obey out of habit. That's the essence of a coup." Lee was concerned that the board might prove irresolute. Hardin assured him that after tomorrow, the board's importance as a factor in terminus affairs wouldn't matter. "They're not bad fellows when they stick to their encyclopedia," he said, "and we'll see that that's where they stick in the future. Now go and get things rolling." Hardin sat down at the corner of his desk, lost in thought. By space, if only he were as confident as he pretended. The Anacreonians were landing in 2 days, and what had he to go on but a set of notions and half-guesses as to what Hari Seldon had been driving at these past 50 years? The Time Vault was furnished with considerably more than 6 chairs, as though a larger company had been expected. Hardin noticed that thoughtfully and seated himself just as far from the other 5 as possible. Hardin glanced at his own watch and then at the glass cubicle, absolutely empty, that dominated half the room. It was the only unusual feature of the room. Aside from that, there was no indication that somewhere a computer was splitting off instants of time toward that precise moment when a muon stream would flow, a connection be made, and the lights went dim. They didn't go out, but merely yellowed and sank with a suddenness that made Hardin jump. He had lifted his eyes to the ceiling lights in a startled fashion, and when he brought them down, the glass cubicle was no longer empty. A figure occupied it, a figure in a wheelchair. It said nothing for a few moments, but it closed the book upon its lap and fingered it idly. And then it smiled, and the face seemed all alive. "I am Hari Seldon," it said. Hardin almost rose to acknowledge the introduction and stopped himself in the act. "As you see," the voice continued, "I am confined to this chair and cannot rise to greet you. Your grandparents left Terminus a few months back in my time, and since then I have suffered an inconvenient paralysis. I can't see you, you know. I don't know how many of you there are, so all this must be conducted informally. If any of you are standing, please sit down, and if you care to smoke, I wouldn't mind." There was a light chuckle. "Why should I?" said Seldon. "I'm not really here." Hari Seldon put away his book as if laying it upon a desk at his side, and when his fingers let go, it disappeared. He began to speak again, acknowledging that it had been 50 years since the Foundation had been established, and that its members had been ignorant of what it was they were working toward of necessity. Now it seemed that necessity was gone. "The Encyclopedia Foundation," said Hari Seldon, "is a fraud, and always has been." There was a sound of a scramble behind Hardin, and 1 or 2 muffled exclamations, but he did not turn around. Hari Seldon was, of course, undisturbed. "It is a fraud," he continued, "in the sense that neither I nor my colleagues care at all whether a single volume of the encyclopedia is ever published. It has served its purpose. By it we extracted an imperial charter from the emperor. By it we attracted the 100,000 humans necessary for our scheme, and by it we managed to keep them preoccupied while events shaped themselves until it was too late for any to draw back. From now on and into the centuries, the path you must take is inevitable. Seldon told the board they would be faced with a series of crises, as they now were with the first, and in each case their freedom of action would become similarly circumscribed so that they would be forced along one and only one path, and that path had been worked out by Seldon's psychohistory for a reason. Somewhere in the 50 years just past was where historians of the future would place an arbitrary line which marked, they would say, the fall of the Galactic Empire. And, said Hari Seldon, they will be right. Seldon proceeded to tell them of the period of inevitable barbarism that would follow the fall, and which, according to psychohistory, and under ordinary circumstances, would last 30,000 years. While they could not stop the fall, they could shorten the period of barbarism that must follow to a single 1,000 years. The ins and outs of that shortening we cannot tell you, said Seldon, but this I can tell you. Terminus and its companion foundation at the other end of this galaxy are the seeds of Renaissance and the future founders of the Second Galactic Empire. And it is the present crisis that is starting Terminus off to that climax, a crisis much simpler than many ahead. You see, then, he concluded, that you are faced by hard necessity, and that action is forced on you. The nature of that action, that is, the solution to your dilemma, is, of course, obvious. The image of Hari Seldon reached into open air, and the book once more appeared in his hand. He opened it and said, "But whatever devious course your future history may take, impress it always upon your descendants that the path has been marked out, and that at its end is a new and greater empire." And as his eyes bent to his book, he flicked into nothingness, and the lights brightened once more. Hardin looked up to see Pirenne facing him, eyes tragic, lips trembling, voice firm but toneless as he told the mayor that he had been right. Each member of the board shook his hand and left, and Hardin smiled to himself. They were fundamentally sound at that, for they were scientists enough to admit that they were wrong, but for them it was too late. He looked at his watch. By this time it was all over. Johann Lee's men were in control, and the board was giving orders no longer. The Anacreonians were landing their first spaceships tomorrow, but that was all right, too. In 6 months they would be giving orders no longer. In fact, as Hari Seldon had said, and as Salvor Hardin had guessed, since the day that Anselm Hort Roderick first revealed to him Anacreon's lack of nuclear power, the solution to this first crisis was obvious. Obvious as all hell. From an entry in the Encyclopedia Galactica, the Four Kingdoms is the name given to those portions of the province of Anacreon which broke away from the First Empire in the early years of the foundational era to form independent and short-lived kingdoms. The largest and most powerful was Anacreon itself. Undoubtedly, the most interesting aspect of the history of the Four Kingdoms involves the strange society forced temporarily upon it during the administration of Salvor Hardin. A deputation. That Salvor Hardin had seen it coming made it none the more pleasant. Johann Lee advocated extreme measures. The deputation of councilmen couldn't do anything till the next election, which was a year away. So why bother with them? Hardin pursed his lips. "In the 40 years I've known you," he said to Lee, "you've never once learned the gentle art of sneaking up from behind." He paused and reached for a cigar. They had come a long way since they'd engineered their coup against the encyclopedists 30 years ago. Those days belonged in the limbo to which all good old days go, toward the same limbo where the Galactic Empire was heading. He wondered who the new emperor was, or if there was a new emperor at all, or any empire. By space, for the past 30 years, since the breakup of communications here at the edge of the galaxy, the whole universe of Terminus had consisted of itself and the four surrounding kingdoms. Lee was at the window, and his voice broke in on Hardin's reverie to say that the deputation had come. The mayor asked Lee for his moral support. "I'll need it with this young Cermak," he added. "That fellow Cermak is dangerous," said Lee. "He's got a following, Hardin, so don't underestimate him." The deputation had come. Hardin stepped on the pedal beneath his desk, and the door slid aside. They filed in, 4 in number, and Hardin waved them gently to the armchairs that faced his desk in a semicircle. They bowed and waited for the mayor to speak. Seth Cermak was the youngest of this young group, and the most interesting. It was on Cermak that Hardin concentrated. "I take it," he said, "that you have come to see me concerning the same foreign policy that annoys you so greatly in the council chamber." Cermak said grimly that he spoke for the people of Terminus, who are not truly represented in the council, and who are dissatisfied with a policy which for 30 years had been stripping Terminus defenseless against the inevitable attack from outside. "Therefore," he said, "we are forming a new political party. We are going to throw you and your lick-spittle clique of appeasers out of City Hall, and soon." Cermak made it clear that this was more than a warning. The new party had been formed and would begin official activities tomorrow. The councilman then rose and motioned the rest up. Hardin lifted his arm and ordered the younger man to sit down. As Seth Cermak seated himself once more, Hardin smiled behind a straight face. "In exactly what way," he asked, "do you want our foreign policy changed? Do you want us to attack the four kingdoms now, at once, and all four simultaneously?" Cermak stated his proposition simply. Hardin's policy of scientific aid and nuclear power to the kingdoms had been carried out to prevent them from attacking Terminus. "With these bribes," he said, "you've been playing the fool in a colossal game of blackmail in which you have allowed Terminus to be sucked dry, with the result that we are now at the mercy of those barbarians. Because the four kingdoms have been given power and weapons, their demands are increasing, and they will eventually satisfy them by violent annexation of Terminus. Isn't that," he asked, "the way blackmail usually ends?" Cermak's remedy was to stop the bribes immediately. "Spend your effort in strengthening Terminus itself," he advised the mayor, "and attack first." Hardin pointed to the motto framed on his wall, which read, "Violence is the last refuge of the incompetent." Cermak's lips twitched. "That's an old man's doctrine," he said. "I applied it as a young man, and successfully," retorted the mayor. "You were busy being born when it happened, but perhaps you may have read something of it in school." He eyed Cermak closely. Anacreon, he continued, was then, as now, the most powerful of the four kingdoms, and demanded, and later actually established, a military base upon Terminus, which was only a preliminary to taking over the entire planet. "What," asked Hardin, "would you have done?" Cermak shrugged his shoulders. "You," said the mayor, "would have attacked first. What I did instead was to visit the 3 other kingdoms one by one, point out to each that to allow nuclear power to fall into the hands of Anacreon was the quickest way of cutting their own throats, and suggest gently that they do the obvious thing. 1 month after the Anacreonian force had landed on Terminus, their king received a joint ultimatum from his 3 neighbors. In 7 days, the last Anacreonian was off Terminus. Where was the need for violence?" The young councilman failed to see the analogy. From his point of view, Hardin's policy of appeasement had driven Terminus to the last refuge. "You still seem to lack a grasp of the fundamental necessities of our position," said the mayor. "Our problem wasn't over with the departure of the Anacreonians. The four kingdoms were more a threat than ever before, for each wanted nuclear power. I played them one against the other. I offered each science, trade, education, scientific medicine. I made Terminus of more value to them as a flourishing world than as a military prize. It worked for 30 years. Cermak pointed out that Hardin had been forced to surround these scientific gifts with outrageous mummery, half religion, half balderdash, with a hierarchy of priests and complicated, meaningless ritual. The mayor frowned. It had started that way because the barbarians looked upon science as a sort of magical sorcery, and it was easiest to get them to accept it on that basis. The priesthood had built itself. "It is a minor matter," said Hardin. "But these priests," said Cermak, "are in charge of the power plants. That is not a minor matter." Hardin explained that the government had trained the priests. Their knowledge of tools was purely empirical, and they had a firm belief in the mummery surrounding them. "In short, gentlemen," he concluded, "the government is of the opinion that it knows what it is doing, and that ends the interview, I'm afraid." He shook hands with each in perfunctory fashion, and they filed out. After Cermak and his three silent partners were well out of earshot, he chuckled dryly and with an amused look asked Lee how he had liked the Battle of Bluffs. Lee was not so sure that Cermak was bluffing. He might just win the next election, and he had a following. What if he didn't wait till the next election? "You and I, Lee, aren't the encyclopedists," said Hardin. "We stand prepared. Order your men onto these youngsters in a nice way, old fellow. Don't let them know they're being watched. By the way," the mayor added, "Ambassador Verisov is returning to Terminus. Temporarily, I hope." There was a short silence, faintly horrified. "Are things breaking already?" Lee asked. His face went dead. "I don't know how it's going to turn out," he said. "You're in too deep, Hardin, and you're playing the game too close to your chest." Poly Verisov was now in the 14th year of his double status on Anacreon, the upkeep of which reminded him often and unpleasantly of a dance performed barefoot on hot metal. To the people of Anacreon he was high priest, representative of the Foundation. To the Anacreon barbarians, the Foundation was the acme of mystery and the physical center of the religion created, with Hardin's help, in the last 3 decades. But to the king of Anacreon, the old one that had been, and the young grandson that was now on the throne, Verisov was simply the ambassador of a power at once feared and coveted. On the whole, it was an uncomfortable job. So his first trip to the Foundation in 3 years, despite the disturbing incident that had made it necessary, was something in the nature of a holiday. This was not the first time he had had to travel in absolute secrecy, and so Verisov changed into his civilian clothes and boarded a passenger liner to the Foundation. 1/2 hour after his arrival at Terminus, with a Terminus City Journal tucked under his arm, Verisov entered City Hall. In doing all this, he remained safely and thoroughly unrecognized. Hardin looked up at him and grinned. He offered the ambassador a cigar and asked how his trip was. Verisov helped himself to the cigar. "There was a priest in the next cabin on my way over who inveigled me into a theological discussion. He never recognized me as his own high priest. It is remarkable," he observed, "how the religion of science has grabbed hold." The mayor placed his arm around Verisov's shoulder and said suddenly, "Start talking about the situation at Anacreon." The ambassador frowned and withdrew the cigar from his mouth. He looked at it distastefully. "Well," he said, "it's pretty bad." Verisov began by explaining that the key man at Anacreon was the Prince Regent Wienus, uncle to King Leopold. Hardin knew this, and that Leopold was coming of age next year. As for Weeanus, Verisov observed that he played the game dirty. His notion of cracking an egg, said the ambassador, is to shoot a nuclear blast at it. He's foaming at the mouth with eagerness to attack the Foundation, and he's in a position to do it, too, from a standpoint of armament. Verisov told Hardin of an incident 2 weeks earlier when an Anacreonian merchant ship had come across a derelict battle cruiser of the old Imperial Navy. Interest flickered in Hardin's eyes. He had heard of the ship. It is in good condition, he noted. In entirely too good condition, responded Verisov. When Weeanus received your note last week suggesting that he turned the ship over to the Foundation, he almost had convulsions. Hardin mentioned that Weeanus hadn't yet answered the note. He won't, said the ambassador, except with guns, or so he thinks. You see, he came to me on the day I left Anacreon. Verisov went on to say that Weeanus had requested that the Foundation put the battle cruiser into fighting order and turn it over to the Anacreonian Navy. He said that Hardin's note indicated that the Foundation had a plan to attack Anacreon, and that refusal to repair the battle cruiser would confirm his suspicions. In that case, measures for the self-defense of Anacreon would be forced upon him. And that, concluded Verisov, is why I am here. Both Hardin and Verisov agreed that Weeanus expected a refusal and a reason to attack. Hardin laughed gently. He told Verisov to have the ship fixed up and present it to Weeanus with the mayor's compliments. Have it renamed the Weeanus, he added, as a mark of our esteem and affection. Although he smiled faintly in response, Verisov admitted that he was worried. It's a ship, he said, they could build in those days. It's got nuclear blasts capable of blowing up a planet. Hardin pointed out that the armament that Weeanus now had could defeat Terminus. What does it matter, he concluded. You know it won't come to actual war. The ambassador looked up. The addition of the Imperial cruiser will just about double the strength of Weeanus' navy, he said. He'll attack as sure as I'm a high priest. In the ancient days, when the Galactic Empire had embraced the galaxy, and Anacreon had been the richest of the prefects of the periphery, more than one emperor had visited the viceregal palace. And not one had left without at least one effort to pit his skill with air speedster and needle gun against the feathered flying fortress they called the Nyack bird. Leopold I, king of Anacreon, and, as was invariably but untruthfully added, lord of the outer dominions, though 3 weeks short of his 16th birthday, had already proved his skill many times over. Weeanus stood upon the threshold of his nephew's chamber and stared at the king's hunting suit morosely. You'll have more important things to tend to than Nyack hunting soon enough. I've been to the ship today, said Weeanus, the one that the Foundation is repairing for the Navy, the old Imperial cruiser. Do I make myself sufficiently plain? Poppycock was the word Leopold used to describe his uncle's story about Terminus wanting to attack Anacreon. If they did, he said, why would they fix the ship? It doesn't make sense, you know. Leopold, you're a fool, said Weeanus. You're in a fine position to assume regal responsibilities. If you spent half the time on public affairs that you do on Nyack hunting, I'd resign the regency directly with a clear conscience. The king complained. The fact is, he said, that even if you are the regent and my uncle, I'm still king and you're still my subject. You oughtn't to call me a fool. I think you ought to be careful, or I might do something about it pretty soon. Weeanus's dark eyes blazed from beneath his grizzled brows, and the young king sat down slowly. Never mind, Leopold, I should not have spoken harshly to you, he said. You will come of age in 2 months, he went on. You will be king henceforward, Leopold, and there will be war with the Foundation. Leopold did not understand. The Foundation had, after all, agreed to repair the ship. But as he spoke, Leopold's voice choked off at the twist of his uncle's lip. Wienis told his nephew, "There will be war with the Foundation, whether the ship is repaired or not." His hand came down on his nephew's knee, and his eyes narrowed. "Leopold, you are the king of Anacreon. Your children and your children's children may be kings of the universe, if you have the power that the Foundation is keeping from us." Leopold's eyes gained a sparkle, and his back straightened. "You see, you're beginning to understand," observed Wienis. Then he asked Leopold to consider what would happen if Smyrno decided to attack the Foundation to gain all that power. How long, he asked, could we escape becoming a vassal power? How long would you hold your throne? Leopold grew excited. "Space, yes," he said. "You're absolutely right, you know. We must strike first, and immediately." Wienis stated firmly that they had to wait for the repairs of the battlecruiser to be complete. The mere fact that Terminus was willing to undertake these repairs proved that they feared Anacreon. Wienis' lips twitched sardonically. "Besides," he added, "we must wait for Salvor Hardin to arrive." The king grew suddenly round-eyed. The youthful contours of his beardless face lost the almost hard lines into which they had been compressed. "Yes, Leopold," said Wienis, "the leader of the Foundation himself is coming to Anacreon for your birthday, probably to soothe us with buttered words, but we won't help him." "Salvor Hardin!" The merest murmur escaped Leopold's lips, and he admitted to his uncle that he was afraid a little. It would be, sort of blasphemous, you know, to attack the Foundation. I mean, if there were really a galactic spirit, he mightn't like it, don't you think? Wienis answered in no uncertain terms. "While the people at large believe in the galactic spirit, it is nonsense. And you may be thankful it's so," he added. "According to this foolishness, you are king by divine right, semi-divine yourself. A handy state which eliminates all possibilities of revolts and ensures absolute obedience in everything. That is why," he concluded, "you must take an active part in ordering war against the Foundation. I am only regent, and quite human. You are king, and more than half a god, to them." The king thought a moment. "But suppose I'm not, really," he said. "No, not really," came the response, "but you are to everyone but the people of the Foundation. Get that? Once they are removed, there will be no one to deny you the godhead." Next to Seth Cermak himself, Louis Bort was the most active in rallying those dissident elements which had fused into the now vociferous Action Party. Yet he had not been one of the deputation that had called on Salvor Hardin almost half a year previously. That this was so was not due to any lack of recognition of his efforts, quite the contrary. He was absent for the very good reason that he was on Anacreon's capital world at the time. He arrived home toward the end of a short winter day that had started with clouds and was finishing with snow, and within an hour was seated at the octagonal table in Cermak's home. "I'm afraid," he said, "that our position is what is usually termed, in melodramatic phraseology, a lost cause. It's the religion the Foundation has established. It works." Cermak asked what kind of religion it was. "Ethically, it's fine," answered Bort. "But the religion, which the Foundation has fostered and encouraged, mind you, is built on strictly authoritarian lines. The priesthood has sole control of the instruments of science we have given Anacreon. They've learned to handle these tools only empirically, but they believe entirely in the spiritual value of the power they handle." Bort explained that the priesthood formed a hierarchy at the apex of which was the king, who was regarded as a sort of minor god. "He's an absolute monarch by divine right, and the people believe it," said Bort. You can't overthrow a king like that. Suddenly the front door opened, and Levy Norast stamped in. He bounded up the stairs, overcoat on, trailing snow. "Look at that!" he cried, tossing a cold, snow-speckled newspaper onto the table. The newspaper was unfolded, and the men bent over it. "Great space!" said Cermak. "He's going to Anacreon. Hardin is going to Anacreon."